Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Ontario Network of CAPC and CPMP Projects webinar series. My name is Sydney Bell and I'm the program lead for the network, and I'm really delighted to have you here with us this afternoon. And we have a really great session today about interpersonal violence. And but before we get into that, and before I introduce our speaker, I would just like to take a moment for us to pause and to offer a gratitude and land acknowledgement as part of our network's ongoing commitment to truth and reconciliation. We acknowledge and give thanks to the First Peoples of the territories where we work and serve, and other Indigenous people for sharing this land in order for us to continue the work that we do with families across Ontario. The land where I'm coming to you from is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and Neutral people. And just want to say that this acknowledgement is offered as an act of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada, and hopefully part of a starting point for that ongoing work. So with that, I'm really delighted to introduce to you Julia Manuel, who is actually from in and around Waterloo Region, where I am in Kitchener. And she is going to lead us through discussion around interpersonal violence and a community-based approach to this work. So Julia, I really welcome. It's great to have you here, and we really appreciate taking time out of what I know is a very busy schedule that you have to talk to us and those of us who work for CAPC and CPMP projects across Ontario about your work. So welcome, Julia. I'm going to hand it over to you. I'll hop off camera, but I am here if you need me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Julia.
Good afternoon, everybody, and happy Friday. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to come and speak to you all today. Domestic violence is one of, I know it sounds weird when you say one of my passions, but that's my area of interest. You know, I always say when I do a presentation, domestic violence or intimate partner violence is a crime that any one of us can be charged with. And as we work through the PowerPoint or the presentation, you'll understand why, and then we can have a conversation at the end to see if you agree or disagree with that statement. I do have a PowerPoint. It's more about guidance for me. But if you have any questions or you have comments, please let Sydney know. I'm happy to answer questions as we go through the presentation, because I'd rather you get the information that you need as opposed to me sit here and just throw information at you. And I like to have input and hear other people's experiences and have a conversation about this topic. So I titled this presentation, It's All About Relationships, for many reasons. As you'll see through when I get into sort of my history, my work experience, I started off as a child protection worker, and actually up in Northern Ontario, and then came down to Guelph. And I remember going to a presentation by Niagara Regional Police. They had held a conference, and they had brought a doctor up from the United States who talked about wraparound services for child victims of sexual abuse and domestic and physical abuse. And she was telling us the story of how she just had this trailer, and she'd had her little medical clinic set up in there, and the social worker would go to the trailer and the police officer would go to the trailer to speak with a child. And I thought that was such an amazing idea. And I think that that's an amazing way to provide services to clients when you're all there, you're all on the same page, and it's a nice flow. And that victim, whether it be adult or child, is not having to go to 9 million different other places. It's all in one spot. They come to one space and they get all the services that they need. As I continue to work I started working in Guelph. I saw that more and more how community partner agencies started to work together. And then I heard about the Family Violence Project here in Waterloo Region and thought that's something that I really want to be a part of, and then transferred over here and has worked. I was the coordinator for the Family Violence Project, and now I'm in this position that I'm in right now. Our program is a partner in it. So I truly believe in working together. Domestic violence, and I keep referring to domestic violence because that's the language that we use. Intimate partner violence, I know, has is sort of like the latest terminology. So I'll flip back and forth because I'll keep reminding myself to say the intimate partner violence. But it is a crime that you cannot deal with alone. It's very complex. And it requires a lot of support, and it requires people working together. So, and now it doesn't want to move for me. Sorry, just give me 1 second. It doesn't want to go here. Sorry. Domestic intimate partner violence can be a very difficult topic to talk about. Some of you may know people who are victims, and some of you may have even experienced it yourself. So at any time you feel you need to take a break from this, please do. Please ensure that you do some self-care. And if there's somebody you can talk to, I would also be available to chat with after if anybody would like to do that. So as I said, every time I read this, or I talk about my experience, I start dating myself more and more. So I've been working in the area of family violence for over 30 years. Started out, as I mentioned, as a child protection worker in Northern Ontario, then moved to Guelph, continued with child protection, Frontline, and then I went to the Victim Witness Assistance Program, which is a program that assists victims of violence through the criminal court process. I did that for about 6 years, and while I was doing that, I obtained my MSW, and then I came over here to Waterloo Region. I transferred over to the Victim Witness Assistance office here in Kitchener, which was part of the Family Violence Project. And I was lucky and fortunate enough to be able to apply and become the coordinator of the Family Violence Project for about 5.5 years. And then I, again, lucky to come here. And in this program, I am the director of the Sexual Assault Domestic Violence Treatment Center for Waterloo Region. And I've been in this position for over 5 years now. It's funny, my background's obviously social work, but working in the medical field, I've learned a lot about a nurse, and I pride myself saying I'm kind of like a nurse now too. So, so I want to start off with a definition. And again, when you're in person, you're able to have the conversation and say, what does intimate partner violence mean to you, and have those questions. And have that conversation. And I know it's really difficult when it's by Zoom because it's harder to have that interaction. But intimate partner violence is any use of physical or sexual force, threatened or actual or threatened in an intimate relationship, including emotional, psychological abuse and harassing behavior. And although both men and women can be victims of intimate partner violence, a lot of our victims, or a huge percentage of our victims, are female. However, in saying that, I can tell you that in the past few months, as a result of COVID, we are seeing more and more men. Actually, our numbers are quite high for men in the past month or so. So, okay. So I'm just going to go over a few stats. Sorry, I've also got this here. Just so that we kind of give a context to, how pervasive intimate partner violence is. So what we know right now is that 1 woman every 6 days is killed by her intimate partner, that it is a very, very expensive issue to deal with, when it's $7.4 billion to deal with the aftermath of spousal violence alone. And then this is, the biggest piece for me as well, is that children who witness violence in the home have twice the rate of psychiatric disorders as children from non-violence homes. And this is a result, this piece right here is a result of the mandatory reporting to Family and Children's Services, because at this point in time, there is so much research and information around the impact of domestic violence or intimate partner violence on kids, and also even on development and emotional development of children, even in uterus. So they are, really realizing the impact. So that's why it's mandatory, so that Family and Children's Services is going out and ensuring that that child is safe. So the child is their client, and they want to know that they're going to be okay. And again, you just have to, research this, and there's all sorts of information that is available that covers the impact.
Excuse me, Julia.
Yes.
We have a question.
Yes.
Tammy Lynn, and she asks, I've heard the term financial abuse.
Yes.
Does that fall under psychological violence?
Does it fall under?
Yeah.
Yes, I would say it can be a separate piece by itself, but you can have the financial abuse. But when you think about the finances and how that, worry and concern, it becomes an emotional or a psychological abuse as well. And if you think of intimate partner violence, even though we break it down to, it's the psychological, the financial, they all intersect, they all intertwine. So when we say intimate partner violence, I mean, that covers a lot. I think we break it down more so when it comes to criminal charges. I think that's when it becomes a little more detailed, and I can talk a little bit about that later on in the presentation.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so continuing on just some facts, 67% of women who have experienced, 67% of Canadians know a woman who has experienced physical or sexual abuse. Indigenous women are killed at 6 times the rate of non-Indigenous women, and 6,000 plus women and children sleep in shelters on every given night because it isn't safe at home. There is also a stat where it also carried on around the access to shelter, and that there is a huge number of women who are turned away from shelters because there isn't enough beds. And we have experienced that here in our region when we've seen a client up at the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning and we're phoning for a bed, and there isn't one available at the 2 shelters or even within the region. And we, with the support of Victim Services of Waterloo Region, are able to find a bed, pay for a hotel room for them. Okay, so we'll continue. I know this is a lot of stats, but I think it's just really important that people get a really clear understanding how much, the impact of domestic violence and how much it does happen in our community. So immigrant and refugee women are more vulnerable to gender-based violence due to language barriers, isolation from their family, and uncertain legal status. We also run into, and I'm sure, given the work that you do, we also run into the whole cultural piece as well. So we have a lot of women who we're aware of, and we may not have actually seen in person, but we've heard are in situations where they are so concerned to come forward because it's not just their abusive partner that they have to deal with, but it's their culture, it's their community that they're living with, and they don't want to bring shame. So there is some of that comes into to play as well. And being deported from the country is a huge piece. There has been some change in immigration law where they recognize domestic violence, and that it is not an automatic send back to their home country anymore, that they would be able to stay within the country in Canada with supports if it is a situation of domestic violence. And then childhood victims of abuse are twice as likely to be at risk of violence victimization as adults compared to those never abused. And I'm sure, again, with your experience and the work that you do and the people you work with, that you would probably see a lot of that, because what we know is that we see our victims here, and then they start talking about the abuse that they experienced as younger, and that they're unable to sometimes recognize those flags in the relationships they're getting into, and sometimes they think it's normalized. We've had women say, "Well, it was just a push, or it was just a slap. It wasn't as bad as my last boyfriend who used to punch me and strangle me." So it's when we deal with women or men who are victims of domestic, it's really important to look back in their history, because how you provide support to that person and guide them through the system is going to be dependent on the information and their backgrounds, and as much as you can get to assist them. Okay, so here's some local statistics here in Kitchener, and this is from Waterloo Regional Police. So in 2019, so average, it's been pretty consistent. So they average about 6,000 calls a year. And in 2019, they had 5,877 domestic violence calls. So incidents where somebody is calling in to the police service. And how it works here for in this region is that when the initial call comes in, a patrol officer would be the first on scene. So they would respond to that call, and then they would investigate, they would speak to interview the victim, they would talk to the accused, they would talk to witnesses. And if they feel that there is enough evidence to lay a charge, they are going to lay a charge, whether that victim wants it or not, because in Ontario, Canada, we have mandatory charging. So they are going to lay a charge. And then once that charge is laid, that call then gets turned over to detectives in the Intimate Partner Violence Unit of Waterloo Regional Police. And then that is more investigated. So that's where it comes to the 1,647 calls that were investigated. And then out of that, those investigations, 3,314 charges were laid. So that was in 2019. And in 2020, you can see that the incidents were up. Actually, they had an 8% increase in intimate partner violent incidents in IPV. More calls were investigated and more charges laid. And they average about an IPV call about every hour and a half that they're responding to that. So as you can see, that it is very much in our community, and the IPV branch is one of the busiest branches of Waterloo Region Police, and they lay the most charges. Okay, does anybody have any questions or anything about that?
Julia, I'm not seeing any questions at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I also want to just touch on, and I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because I know we have, limited time. So the impetus to change, and what that means is that the Ontario government started looking at how do we handle, and at that time it was domestic violence. How do we handle domestic violence cases? So in 1996, they created the Bill of Rights for Victims. So when anybody ever goes to court, they're told that they have rights in court, and they will go over. And those rights are, include knowing what's going on in a criminal case, having the ability to meet with a Crown attorney, being told about court dates and outcomes, being able to be in court if they choose to be. So all those rights, that was established for those victims. And then in 1998, there was a big case, which was the first domestic homicide inquest in Ontario. And that was through Adrienne May and Randy Isles inquest. And what was, that was a big case. And I remember actually we had the OPP officer who actually investigated that murder come and speak to us about this case, because it really did highlight a lot of issues that were going on in respects to communication between police services, between service agencies and police services, because this was an ongoing domestic violence relationship. Violent, and many times Adrienne May tried to get away from Randy Isles, and he would follow her. And then what ended up happening is what they were living in jurisdictions that bordered each other, and so they would move over to one jurisdiction, and the police service in that jurisdiction was not aware of the past domestic violence incidents from the other police department, and Randy Isles ended up killing Adrienne May, even though police services were aware of the issues, but it kind of fell through the cracks because nobody was talking to each other. And out of that, there was 213 recommendations. Then there was the creation of the Joint Committee on Domestic Violence, and that came out in 1999, and that's in 1998. And then the Joint Committee report on domestic violence, working towards a seamless community and justice response to domestic violence, a 5-year plan for Ontario, came out in 1999. And some of you may have seen that because it's a thick blue book, about so thick, and it just really outlined best practices.
Julia?
Yes?
Are you able to speak to, we have a question around calls in and investigations.
Okay.
So, so if there were, the 6,100 calls made and just 1,785 investigated, are you able to speak to that sort of discrepancy between the number of calls that were made and the number of cases that were investigated?
Sure. So what that means is that just say, and it would be similar, like it would, and this is where I say this could happen to any one of us, that you're having an argument with your significant other, and you are yelling at each other. Your neighbor calls the police. The police show up. There's no evidence that there was an assault. Nobody's hurt, nobody's crying, nothing's broken in the house, there's no holes in the walls. It's just a very loud argument. That would be classed as a call of a domestic violence incident or intimate partner violence incident, but no charges laid.
Thank you.
Okay. However, and where the charges were laid is if your neighbor calls and says they're screaming at each other, and I have just heard something bang and something smashing in there. And police show up, and yes, there was an all-out argument, and there's a plate smashed on the floor, and there's a hole punched in the wall. They're going to lay a charge, because that's psychological and intimidation, and that punch in the wall is a very clear message to that woman. It could be, or to the other partner, that I can hurt you. Like, next time this is going to be you. So the police will lay a charge because it's in a domestic incident. Is that clear?
Great.
Yeah.
Yes, for me. Yeah, hopefully. Thanks for the question, Carol. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Julia.
Okay. So then also, so all these changes were going on to try and increase services to victims of violence. Ministry of, I'm not sure, I can't remember what that stands for. I've totally lost it. MC and CS implements adequacy standards for DV investigations. So that's Ministry of Corrections Ministry of Safety and Correctional Services. So that sort of oversees police. So they came out with, when a domestic violence investigation is initiated, these are the steps you shall take. And one that came out was the mandatory charging. And mandatory charge, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And I will say, in my personal opinion, it's a good thing. And the reason I say that, because the whole point of mandatory charging was to take that onus off the victim to lay the charge. And I have had experienced officers or senior officers who have told me stories about when they would go to a domestic violence call and the woman would answer the door with a black eye, bleeding lip or bleeding nose, crying, and they stood there and they had to ask her, do you want to lay charges? So if you think about that, if you were in that situation and your husband or your partner is in the room, you know, behind you, and the police are asking you if you want to lay a charge, women are not going to say, yes, I'm going to lay the charge, because they have to then still live with this person or have this person behind them. So what the mandatory charge does is that it does take that onus off the woman. It's the police that lay a charge. The victim doesn't have any say in the matter. The charge is laid, and police have to lay the charge. If there's evidence to corroborate charging, they will lay that charge. So I would rather see that, because there was also some discussion around whether police officers should have discretion, whether they lay the charge or not. But then you get into your personal biases becoming involved. What an officer may think is nothing, if if it was a shove or whatever, he may not see that as abusive. Then it gets into you're getting into that whole place where charges still may not be laid. So mandatory charge takes it off the woman, even if it's a minor situation. Courts now have created a process where they expedite those cases. So where it is, the charge is laid, it was an argument, cell phone got smashed, one of the conditions automatically that's put into place when somebody is charged is that you cannot have any direct or indirect contact with the victim. So then, so the courts have recognized that can be very, very stressful on a family when it's what we would consider a minor assault. So they have, as I said, created a process to expedite it so that the accused person gets home quicker. But it is a safety net for women. They also implemented the KGB victim interviews. And what that means is that when a woman is interviewed by police, they have her swear at the beginning of that statement under video that they're giving that statement under their own, on their own accord, and that they're telling the truth. There is some work, my understanding now, is to move away from those KGB interviews. But what it also does is that it allows that video, if the victim is unable to provide a statement in court or to attend court, that they can play that video of her story. We then had another domestic homicide in 2002, which was Jillian Hadley, and she was killed by her husband. And again, that was another situation where people were very aware, including family members, what was happening. They were aware of the abuse. They were aware of what he was doing, the threat that he was to her, and very little was done about it. He did end up killing her. And out of that inquest, there was another 58 recommendations about how, how domestic violence incidents should be dealt with. And then, the Coroner's Death Review Committee, that is still in effect. And every year, the committee creates a report that highlights cases where there is domestic homicide or domestic homicide suicide, and the matter has gone through the court, has been completed, has been resolved, and then they make recommendations as well. And Dr. Peter Jaffe from Western University, the Institute of Research of Violence Against Women and Children, he is the head of that. He chairs that committee. So a lot of good things come, and it sounds terrible because it's coming out of the death of somebody, and that's, you know, I'm not dismissing that, but these reports highlight areas of where there is improvement that can be made for services for women and children, or for victims. Okay.
Julia, we have a couple questions here,
Okay, sure.
if the time. Sort of a follow-up question around calls and charges.
Yes.
So in these numbers, I think that you offered, would it also be recording dual charges? Example of a punched wall and broken plate could also be a base for a dual charge. Does that make sense, the question?
Yeah, yeah. So I would probably say something like that would be one charge, and it would be mischief under 5,000. So that's what I would say for that. They could say mischief, like they could say, you know, 2 counts of mischief under 5,000. But that would also be the officer, that would be the officer's discretion. But yes, they could do 2 individual, or they could do 1. A lot of times what will happen, especially in real, when there's injuries, they would charge somebody with assault caused bodily harm, mischief under, threatening, you know, and then what happens, like they'll have 4 or 5 charges, go to court, and then they would have the, you know, their lawyer, the accused lawyer with who's known as the defense lawyer, would be saying, okay, he'll plead or she would plead to these 3 charges if you drop these 2 charges. And it's usually the most serious charge that they'll want to have dismissed.
Right, thank you. The other question was about do police always enter the home? For example, if both parties are outside arguing when the police get there, like is there an automatic going into the home, do you know?
I'm going to say that is dependent upon the situation, but I'm going to say I would guess yes. And the reason I say that is that if the 2 people outside arguing on the front lawn, they're going to want to separate them so that they can talk to them independently. They're also, if children are involved, they're also going to want to go in and make sure the children are okay as well.
Right, makes sense. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I just want to make sure I'm conscious of the time here. So this is Adrienne May, 1957 to 1996. And, you know, I've already sort of covered some of this information, where that's May's murder resulted in the first inquest in Ontario that examined the roots of domestic violence and how police and courts treat victims and perpetrators. It started in February and it ended in July after 10 days of deliberation. And they came back, as I said, with 213 recommendations, and requesting in their opening statement a zero tolerance of domestic violence, recognition of the unique aspects of domestic violence as a crime, and a goal of a seamless program across Ontario for victims of this crime. So as a result of that, and of the movement, you know, around addressing the issues around domestic violence, Waterloo Regional Police Service stepped back and said, okay, what are we doing differently? What can we do differently? Because they had 138 supervisors who were all treating domestic violence differently, because they're all coming from different backgrounds, different experiences. they saw, you know, looking at domestic violence as a prevention of a homicide. And also, when you had a investigation with frontline officers, it takes a lot of work to investigate a domestic violence or an IPV incident, and it took officers off the off patrol at the time for hours and hours. So they stepped back and said, okay, we have to look at all these things and we have to figure out how are we going to do this differently. And then they started looking at the best practices worldwide. And they, in conjunction with a few other partner agencies, heard about the family justice centers down in the United States. And Casey Gwynn and Gail Stracht were the two people heading up that, and they were both prosecutors down in the States. And they had these justice centers where they had brought agencies together under one roof. And it was very police focused and justice focused down there. And so some officers from here, some other partner agencies, I think there was a Crown Attorney that went down, victim witness went down, there was another from our program went down to the States, had a tour and felt this is the best way to do this. And they come back to Waterloo Region and they created the Family Violence Project of Waterloo Region. Now, I know a lot of you are around different parts of Ontario, and I'm using the Family Violence Project as an example, but a lot of you have the same agencies within your own communities, because when you start looking at who's involved, you can see that we have our program, which is the Waterloo Region Sexual Assault Domestic Violence Treatment Centers. So we work. We're in this build. We're located at 400 Queen. There's myself and the administrative assistant, and we have 12 social workers and 12 forensic nurses that are on our team, and they are on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and respond to two hospitals, St. Mary's Hospital in Kitchener and Cambridge Memorial in Cambridge. We also have women's crisis services in the same building. Actually, they're just down the hall from us. And we also had CAPC as a part of our part of this project. And CAPC, I think, is an important part of this project. And I'm not just saying that because I'm doing a presentation. I'm saying that because you're working with the kids when they're young. You're getting into those families where there's young children and young parents. And that's where I think we need to start doing the work, is that if there is domestic violence or intimate partner violence that's happening in the home, that's where we need to get in when these children are young, where we can start providing those services, where we start providing the education to let parents know that this is not how relationships are, but really important for kids to learn that this is not how relationships are. This is not how a man treats a woman, and this is not how a woman is to be treated. So it is really important. We have family children services as well. And then we have the counseling. And then for partners, for justice partners, we have the Waterloo Regional Police Domestic Violence Investigative Branch. And I apologize, I missed to update that because they have actually just changed their name in January to an Intimate Partner Violence Unit. We have the Crown Attorney's Office. We have the Victim Services Unit of the Waterloo Regional Police Services. We have the Elder Abuse and Legal Aid that comes here. So we're all under one roof. And when victims come in, I'll use our program for an example. So when the team's called into the hospital, our hospital now, and I'm not sure how it is around the rest of the province, but our hospital, St. Mary's, and Cambridge, and actually we have 3 hospitals in our region. Grand River is one as well, and all the hospitals screen for intimate partner violence and St. Mary's does it to any person over the age of 14, male or female. And it's part of the actually triage information that they fill in on the computer system. And if at the time when they ask the question, or that nurse feels that they are unable to ask the question because that victim or that person may not be able to answer that question because there's somebody right beside them, that if it's left unasked, that gets flagged. So when that person goes to into the inventory, then they will be asked again. And if they say, yeah, I'm not safe, then they would ask if they wanted to see our team. They would explain who we are and whether they want to speak to us. If they say yes, we get called in. We respond within 45 minutes. If there's injuries, the nurse can help with that. We can document evidence. We can document bruises, scratches, things like that. We do take photographs or do body maps. If we need to take their clothing, seize their clothing, do all that, we can do all that. Part of our job is also to provide options to victims, and one of the options is to contact Waterloo Region Police if they're not already involved. So that's entirely up to the victim. That's not our role to tell them what they should or should not do. If they want police, we would initiate for that process. However, if they are already, if police are already involved, we can work with that victim and work with the police officers as well. We then can connect them to all the services that are in this building. And the aim of this project is that a victim walks through the front door and has all the services, has that wraparound seamless service to address all the issues that they are experiencing. And I know COVID has really changed changed a lot of things, obviously. Excuse me, especially, people wanting to come into the building. But we still, like at the hospital, we would still respond. But then we can connect them with people, right? So then we would say, okay, here's Women's Crisis Services, and we can actually walk them down the hall to introduce them to the worker there and say they're going to help, and they can help with the all those practical pieces around housing, safety planning, legal aid, whether they need to help in getting financial support. So they can help with all those pieces, as well as say, okay, well, did you want to get more counseling? So then they can connect with a counseling agency. The police here, we work very closely with police because of the evidence collection that we do, but they really appreciate knowing that they can bring a victim down the hall or contact one of us to come and speak with a victim, to offer that support and to offer that information. I know, and I sit at a network, like our program is part of the Ontario network of sexual assault and domestic violence treatment centers. And, when we've have our quarterly meetings, I know that in some jurisdictions that relationships aren't the greatest with police services or with their shelters. But if there's anything that I could say or, really encourage, is really encourage to build those relationships, because once you have those relationships and you get a clear understanding of what each other's roles are, and it is really, really helpful, because I can tell you, when you think, and I use police as the example all the time, just because when you're dealing with victims, they get very frustrated with police because, you know, whether it's A, because they did do something, or B, because they didn't do something, like they laid a charge, they didn't lay a charge. And then a lot of times women don't want their partners charged. They just want the abuse to stop. And so when you've got somebody who shows up at your, you know, an officer who shows up at your house and you just want him to tell your husband to stop hitting you, and he ends up arresting him and taking him out of your home, you're going, what is going on? That is not what I want. So there's a lot of anger because now this woman is thinking he can't, you know, they can't have communication with her husband. The kids can't see their dad till Family and Children's Services gets involved. Family and Children's Services is involved now. So it's this great big you know, upset in their life. And that's where I'm saying it gets it's a very complex in a situation, and it gets very convoluted, and it's stressful, and it's very upsetting. But when you're able to have a conversation where I can go down the hall to an officer and say, can you explain to me why you laid this charge, or can you explain to me why you didn't lay this charge? And it's not about us questioning that officer's job or role. It's getting clarification, because I can come back, or one of our team members can come back and say to that person or that victim that's sitting in front of, okay, so this is why this did not happen, and here's the reason. And in many times we've actually had the officer come down and say, listen, I couldn't lay the charge, and actually speak to the victim. Policing is very black and white. It's like they have the criminal code. If it doesn't fit in the criminal code, they're not going to get charged. If it fits in the criminal code, they're going to get charged. Whereas our job, and when I say our, not just our program, but Women's Crisis Services, counseling, we deal with that gray area. So like the financial abuse, as somebody mentioned earlier, the psychological abuse. There's nothing in the criminal code as a definition per se as psychological abuse, but we can sit when a woman's coming and saying, he's calling me a fat cow, he's calling me this, he's telling me that, he's doing all these things, but it's just below that line of criminality where they can't lay a charge. We can provide services, so that woman can come in and see every service in this building without seeing the police. So we can still support, but when you have that connection, when you have those conversations with your partners, when you understand what everybody's role is and how you can work together to provide services. One thing that we do here, we have a child and youth advocacy program that is in the building. So we see a lot of young people at the hospital. They work with a lot of young people, and what we're finding is working amazingly well is having case conferences. We'll say like, okay, so you're working with this child, we're working with this child and the family, and there's this other agent. We all just come together and say, obviously with consent, and of consent of the client, that we'll all come together and say, okay, how are we going to deal with this? How are we all going to work together to get this through? And I'll just give you a quick example, because I do want to leave time if there's any questions. We had two young girls who were in a group home here in Kitchener who were exhibiting very high-risk behaviors. They were connecting with older men. They were engaging in sexual activity. There was some drug use. There was drinking. And it got to the point where they were, going out, being sexually assaulted, coming up to the hospital. We would do IPV and treat, but it was becoming a regular thing. So we all were like, okay, you know what? And these girls were from out of town as well. And we're like, okay, this is not good. So it's not good that they were coming up to the hospital on a regular basis, because the high risk behavior that's not a good thing. They could end up being seriously hurt, if not killed. They were associating with people who could seriously injure them or kill them. And it was just like, how are we going to handle this? So we just said, okay, so that there was probably about 15 of us on a conference call saying, okay, how are we going to support this child? How are we going to deal with this behavior to keep her safe? And then we just sort of did regular case conferences, and that young person is now in a treatment home in another jurisdiction. So good things can come when you work together. And I feel like I'm preaching right now, but I have been here now. How long have I been this? 11 years, and to see what can be done, to see the work that can be done, and to see the successes at the end of it, by working with everybody working together is amazing. Oh, so okay, so I've done my little speech.
Great speech, Julia. Your passion is evident, and I think you may be preaching, but I think there's a lot of resonance with sort of how we, with CAPC and CPNP, approach our working community, for sure, that we can appreciate the power of those collaborations and working together.
And my experience, with having CAPC as part of the partnership, and Judy Hurst, I worked here in Kitchener, so close with Judy, and we would go and do presentations to their group, and you could see when you've got nursing, you've got teachers, you've got public health coming in. I mean, that's just, and that's how it should be, right? Like when those supports for those kids, and you just see everybody wrapping around, coming together. Yeah, so it's an amazing thing to see.
Absolutely. Now, we did have a question come in a few minutes ago.
Yes.
And Lori asks, do you have a suggestion of how you might word the question? I think when you're talking with suspected victims, right? When you're trying to assess what's going on. And she asks, is there a best practice way of wording how you might broach that inquiry?
And are you saying that if you suspect?
I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I would be saying is, I just want to make sure you're okay. I'm noticing that, whether you've noticed a change in behavior, a change in personality, attitude, or you've noticed injuries, I think it's just to say, I just want to make sure you're okay. I'm really concerned. If you ever want to talk, please come, I'm here for you. Even if you have information, like I can show you for our region, and I'm sure a lot of others have it. Women's Crisis Services has a little card like this, and it has numbers on it. So, or we have a pamphlet on domestic violence and or sexual assault that explains the process, and some of the resources is available. But just being there and listening and providing that support in a non-judgmental way, I think just leaving that open, because as the stats, I think now it's 7 times. A person will leave 7 times before they actually leave. Like they'll leave and go back, and so that's how I would be doing it. Just being able to say, I'm here, I care, I'm worried about you, because it's sending the message to that person that you're aware something's going on, but you're leaving the dignity, she's not going to embarrass her or anything like that, or him, and then and provide some information. Right.
There was a follow-up that Lori provided to her question of a tool with the acronym RUCS, so Routine Universal Comprehensive Screening Tool. She's wondering if you're aware of it, I would assume, and if you see any that it might be helpful in a situation like that.
I'm not familiar with that one. The one that we kind of go with around here is actually, let me just grab it. Give me one sec. I have it here. So we sort of go there's a couple of screening tools we use, but one is the Ontario Domestic Violence Death Review Committee Risk Factor Coding Form. And it has 39 risk factors. And we usually go I mean, the number one risk factor is pending or actual separation. With a, when a woman is planning to leave a relationship, that's where we highly recommend that it's done in a planful way, because the risk is so high. And then after she's left, like that, there's all supports, everything built in, counseling, things like that. But this coding form, it's got, we usually go about the top 2 or 3 to really go. You listen for those pieces. People are talking and you just kind of go, okay, because that's not a good thing. But I do want to share something, that even though you can have a case, and we see it over and over, you can have a case where you've got 15 risk factors and nothing happens. Okay, like you can have a case, we have 1 risk factor, and somebody can be seriously hurt or killed. So every case has to be taken with on its own merit. You have to really listen, and you do your safety planning, you do everything, you provide your services, your resources. But I will say to this, because this, and I mean, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted, but people, and I see it with some of our team members, you get so worried about a victim, and everybody's doing everything they can. A victim still has responsibility within that situation. So if everybody's doing 110%, and that victim makes choices that we may not agree with, it's still that victim's right to make that choice.
Right. So
it can
important.
be very frustrating.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I see that we are just a minute after 2:00.
Yes.
Was there any final thoughts that you had? I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat at this point.
Okay.
But any final thoughts from you, Julia?
Well, all I'm going to say is thank you so much for letting me present today. I really appreciate it. That if anybody has any comments or questions, please reach out to me. Whether they go through you, Sydney, or they contact me directly. It's and if there's, I'd be happy to have a chat.
That's great. Thank you so much. This was just really informative. It's the second time I've listened to you in the last little while, and I still find myself just, glued right in and learning. So
Thank you.
really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And just want to remind everybody, I did put a link to a little evaluation form in the chat, and I'll send that out in an email as well. We really appreciate your feedback. And I think that wraps up today. So thanks again, Julia. Thanks to everybody. And I hope everybody has a lovely weekend, and that we see you again soon, hopefully at some of our sessions at the conference next week. So I'm assuming you've all seen the newsletter and have registered for some of the great sessions next week. So take care, everybody, and we will talk to you soon. And